If you can see the stars from your window tonight, you are looking at the same sky that Abraham saw thousands of years ago. One night, God told him to count those stars. He promised Abraham that his family would be just as many, even though he was an old man with no children at all. Tonight's story is about waiting for that impossible promise to come true. It's a story about a faith that was sometimes weak, but always found its way back to God. If you find rest in these old stories, you can leave a like to let me know. And I always love reading the comments to see what time it is in your part of the world. Chapter 1. The Call from God. The voice was not of this world. It did not echo from the mountain peaks or whisper on the desert wind. It bloomed within him, a resonance that bypassed the ear to settle deep in the marrow of his soul. Abram stood motionless in the dusty courtyard of his home in Haran. The familiar sounds of the city, the bleating of sheep, the chatter of merchants, the rhythmic clang of a distant blacksmith, fading into a dull hum. The sun, a relentless bronze disk, beat down upon his shoulders, but he felt a different warmth, an internal fire ignited by the divine imperative that now filled his being. Leave your country, leave your kindred, leave your father's household. The command was absolute, a severing of every earthly tie that gave a man identity and security. He was to go to a land that would be shown to him, a destination held only in the mind of God. There was no map, no description of fertile valleys or flowing rivers, only the unwavering certainty of the call itself. To any other man, it would have been the height of folly, the ravings of a madman. But for Abram, the voice carried the weight of a truth more solid than the stones of his house, a promise that resonated with a clarity that silenced all doubt. He turned from the courtyard and walked into the cool, shadowed interior of his home. His wife, Sarai, was weaving, her hands moving with a practiced, graceful rhythm. She looked up, and her hands stilled. She saw the change in him, the new light in his eyes, the set of his jaw that spoke of a resolve forged in a crucible beyond her understanding. He did not need to explain the inexplicable. A silent understanding passed between them, a testament to the shared journey of their lives. She simply nodded, her own faith a quiet, sturdy companion to his. Then came the work of unraveling a life. Servants were summoned, their faces a canvas of confusion and burgeoning excitement. Tents of woven goat hair were pulled from storage, their dusty folds shaken out, releasing the scent of old journeys. Wooden chests were packed not with treasures of silver and gold, but with the practical necessities of survival. Grinding stones, skins for water, sacks of grain, and the cherished bronze tools that could mend a cart or shape a hearth. Herds of sheep and goats were gathered from their pastures, their anxious bleating adding to the murmur of the growing caravan. His nephew Lot, young and full of ambition, eagerly marshaled his own considerable flocks and possessions, his decision to join them made with the impulsive certainty of youth. Neighbors and relatives came to their gates, their faces etched with concern and disbelief. They spoke of the dangers, the bandits that haunted the trade routes, the unforgiving deserts, the hostile tribes that guarded their territories with fierce jealousy. They pleaded for reason, for caution, for the preservation of the comfortable life he had built. Abram heard their words, appreciated the love from which they sprang, but his heart was fixed on a horizon visible only to him. His home, the city of Haran, with its bustling markets and familiar streets, was no longer his home. It had become a waypoint, a memory already fading. On the morning of their departure, the air was thick with the dust of their own making. The caravan stretched out, a slow-moving river of life and livelihood. Abram took one last look at the house where he had known peace and prosperity, its mud brick walls glowing in the dawn light. There was no regret in his gaze, only a profound and solemn acceptance. He placed a hand on Sarai's shoulder as she sat upon her camel, her face veiled against the sun and the stares of the onlookers. He met Lot's eager eyes and gave a firm, reassuring nod. Then, without a backward glance, he turned his face toward the south. He walked ahead of the procession, his staff striking the hard-packed earth with a steady, purposeful rhythm. The road unwound before him, a pale ribbon disappearing into a landscape of rolling hills and arid plains. He did not know its name, this promised land. He did not know its climate, its people, or its perils. His guidance was not a star or a sign, but the indelible memory of a voice that had spoken his name. Each step was an act of pure faith, a surrender of his own will to a divine plan whose fullness was yet to be revealed. He was a man leaving everything for a promise, walking into the unknown with nothing but the certainty of the one who had called him. Chapter 2. Leaving Haran, the finality of departure settled like dust upon the caravan. The last lingering embraces with family in Haran had been given, the final words of caution and blessing swallowed by the growing distance. Sarai, seated high upon her camel, kept her face turned toward the receding skyline of the city long after its walls had melted into the shimmering heat haze. Her heart was a heavy, complicated weight, tethered by memory to the familiar courtyards and shaded rooms they were leaving behind. Lot, riding beside her, projected a brash confidence, his gaze fixed on the open horizon, but the tight grip he kept on his reins betrayed the nervous energy coursing beneath his youthful bravado. Abram walked at the head of the procession, a solitary figure against the vastness of the land. His staff was more than a tool for walking. It was a scepter of his new, uncertain kingdom, marking time with each dull thud against the sun-baked earth. The well-worn trade route soon gave way to less traveled paths, the landscape shifting from cultivated fields to wild, rolling hills studded with tough, gnarled shrubs. The air itself changed, losing the familiar scents of Haran's bakeries and livestock pens, replaced by the dry, aromatic perfume of thyme and wild sage crushed under countless hooves and feet. Doubts, as subtle and persistent as gnats, began to swarm in the quiet moments. In the deep silence of the night, under a canopy of unfamiliar stars, the voice of God felt like a dream, and the sheer audacity of their undertaking pressed in on him. He watched Sarai's silent profile, etched with a sorrow she would not speak aloud, and felt the burden of his decision. He saw the questioning glances from his servants, men who had left their own families on the strength of his faith. The promised land was a phantom, a destination with no name and no borders, and the wilderness through which they traveled was a tangible, unforgiving reality of thirst, exhaustion, and lurking danger. It was during one of these periods of creeping uncertainty, after days of traversing a particularly barren stretch of country, that they came upon a small sheltered valley. A thin stream of clear water cut through its center, and a grove of terebinth trees offered a reprieve from the relentless sun. As the servants hurried to water the flocks and set up the tents, Abram felt a familiar stirring, a counter melody to the dissonance of his fears. It was the echo of the promise, a reaffirmation that did not come as a new voice, but as a resurgent certainty in his spirit. He did not wait for the camp to be fully settled. Taking a few of his men, he climbed a low rise at the edge of the grove, a place that commanded a view of the valley and the wilderness beyond. There, with his own hands, he began to gather stones. They were not special stones, just the common gray field stones of the land, still warm from the day's heat. He worked methodically, his muscles straining as he lifted and placed them, building a simple, unadorned altar. It was a deliberate act of defiance against doubt, a physical declaration of ownership in a land that was not yet his. When the structure was complete, a rough-hewn pyramid of silent testimony, Abram stood before it. He did not ask for a sign or a renewed promise. Instead, he offered worship. He called upon the name of the Lord, his voice the only sound above the whisper of the wind in the trees. It was an act of remembrance, of anchoring his soul to the one fixed point in his unraveled world. The smoke from his sacrifice curled upward, a frail gray thread connecting the parched earth to the heavens, a visible manifestation of his invisible faith. As the familiar sacred scent filled the air, the anxieties that had plagued him seemed to dissipate like the smoke itself, carried away on the evening breeze. The altar stood as their first landmark in the unknown, a testament that wherever they were led, God was there. The journey was far from over, the destination still a mystery, but in that moment, in that act of worship, Abram found the strength to take the next step and the next. Chapter 3. Arrival in Canaan. The land unfolded before them like a long-held secret finally revealed. For weeks, the horizon had been a blurred line of dust and heat, but now it sharpened into a tapestry of rolling hills and verdant valleys. The air lost its dry, punishing edge, carrying instead the moist, fertile scent of earth after rain and the distant perfume of wildflowers. They had crossed into Canaan, and the very ground beneath their feet seemed to pulse with a latent promise, a deep, resonant hum that was felt more than heard. The weary caravan, a trail of dust and bleating animals, slowed its pace as if in reverence, the traveler's eyes wide with a mixture of relief and awe. This was not merely another territory on their journey. This was a destination that had existed only as a divine whisper in Abram's soul, now made manifest in soil and stone. They entered through the great central ridge, the hills rising around them in gentle wooded slopes. Ancient oaks and terebinths stood as silent sentinels, their gnarled branches casting shifting patterns of shadow and light on the path. Springs bubbled from rocky clefts, feeding streams that carved silver veins through the lush greenery. It was a land of stark contrasts, barren, sun-bleached heights giving way to pockets of astonishing fertility, a land that demanded resilience, but rewarded it with its bounty. They passed cultivated fields where barley and wheat swayed in the breeze, and saw in the distance the walled cities of the Canaanites, their formidable silhouettes a reminder that this promised land was already home to powerful peoples, their gods rooted in every high place and sacred grove. Abram led his people to a place called Shechem, a broad, fertile plain nestled between the mountains of Ebal and Gerizim. It was here, as the tents were being pitched and the flocks released to graze on the rich grass, that the presence of God descended once more. It was not the internal voice that had called him from Haran, but a tangible, overwhelming manifestation that filled the space around the great oak of Moreh. The air grew still and heavy, charged with a holiness that made the hairs on Abram's arms stand on end. A profound silence fell, swallowing the everyday noises of the camp, and in that silence the Lord appeared to him. The promise was renewed, but now it was given geography. The divine voice spoke not of a land to be shown, but of this land upon which he stood. The words wove themselves into the very fabric of the place, the soil, the trees, the streams. To your offspring I will give this land, the voice declared, a decree that echoed through the valleys and up the stony slopes. It was a promise that reached beyond Abram's own lifetime, planting a seed in the future that would grow into a nation. In that moment, the wandering ceased to be an aimless trek and became a purposeful possession. He was not a visitor, but an inheritor. The sight of the Canaanite cities and their armed patrols no longer inspired trepidation, but a quiet, unshakable conviction that the true deed to this land was held in heaven. Driven by a surge of gratitude that was as deep and urgent as the call that had started his journey, Abram knew what he must do. Once again, he gathered stones, this time from the creek bed that ran through the plain of Shechem. His hands, now calloused and weathered from the long road, worked with a reverent certainty. He built an altar there by the oak of Moreh, a simple, sturdy structure that stood as his first act of ownership, his first declaration of faith in the promise made tangible. As the stones were stacked, each one was a silent prayer, a testament of thanks for the journey's end and the promise's beginning. When he offered a sacrifice, the smoke rose straight and pure into the calm Canaanite sky, a fragrant column of worship that consecrated the ground. And so they settled. Abram's tents became a semi-permanent feature on the plain, his flocks and herds spreading across the pastures. Life took on a new rhythm, dictated by the seasons of this new land. Yet their existence was one of peaceful coexistence, not conquest. They lived among the Canaanites, these people of the land with their own deep history and powerful kings. Abram made no claim of lordship, raised no army. His claim was not enforced by the sword, but by the altar. His ownership was not yet one of territory, but of promise. He was a sojourner in the land of his inheritance, a man living in the tension between the present reality and the future fulfillment, his faith rooted as deeply as the great oak under which he worshipped, waiting for the seed of the promise to take root and grow. Chapter 4. Famine in the land. The promise had been given form in the lush valleys and wooded hills of Canaan, but the land's benevolence proved as fickle as a desert mirage. The life-giving rains, which had once fallen in gentle, consistent rhythms, ceased. The sky became a hard, cloudless bowl of brass, and the sun, once a source of growth, transformed into a merciless tyrant. Day after day it beat down upon the earth, baking the soil to a cracked, pale crust. The streams that had carved silver veins through the greenery shrank to muddy trickles, then vanished entirely, leaving behind only gasping, stone-filled beds. The vibrant grasses of the plains withered to brittle, yellow stubble, and the leaves on the great oaks curled inward, their edges browned and desperate. The bleating of the flocks changed from a contented murmur to a constant plaintive cry of hunger and thirst. The famine did not creep in. It fell upon the land like a shroud, heavy and suffocating, Abram watched the life drain from the promise. The same fields that had welcomed him with abundance now mocked him with their barrenness. His herds, the visible sign of God's blessing, grew thin and listless, their ribs pressing against their hides like the bars of a cage. The fear that had been a distant whisper on the journey from Haran now became a loud, clamoring presence in his camp. He saw it in the sunken eyes of his shepherds and in the weary slump of Sarai's shoulders as she tried to stretch their dwindling stores of grain. The divine covenant felt abstract, a distant dream overshadowed by the immediate, grinding reality of starvation. The promised land was dying, and with it the future it was meant to hold. Whispers of a solution began to circulate among the servants, carried on the same dry winds that scoured the hills. To the southwest lay Egypt, a kingdom cradled by the great life-giving river Nile. While Canaan starved, Egypt, they said, always flourished. Its fields were perpetually green, its granaries overflowing. It was a land of impossible stability, its wealth and power built upon the predictable annual inundation of its river. The decision to go there was not born of faith, but of a desperate, pragmatic need to survive. To stay in Canaan was to watch his people and his promise perish. To go to Egypt was to admit a temporary defeat, to turn his back on the land God had given him in order to preserve the life necessary to one day possess it. As they prepared for the journey south, a more insidious fear began to coil in Abram's gut, colder and sharper than the fear of hunger. He had seen the way men looked at Sarai. Her beauty was not merely a feature of her face, it was a presence, a radiance that had endured the harshness of their travels. In Canaan, among the scattered clans and tribes, they had been able to move with a degree of anonymity. But Egypt was a kingdom of powerful, centralized authority, its pharaoh a god-king whose whims were law. Abram, a nomadic chieftain with a dwindling fortune, would be no more than a speck of dust before such power. He imagined the scenario with a chilling clarity. A royal official, or perhaps the pharaoh himself, seeing Sarai, desiring her, and simply taking her. And what would stop them from killing her foreign husband to remove any inconvenient claim or complication? The plan formed in his mind not as a grand deception, but as a desperate, half-truthful shield. Sarai was, in fact, his half-sister, the daughter of his father, though not of his mother. It was a technicality, a sliver of fact that he could cling to in order to justify the lie he was about to build his family's safety upon. He went to her in their tent, the air inside stifling and thick with dust. He found her packing their few remaining valuables, her movements efficient but weary. He spoke to her quietly, his voice low and urgent, explaining the danger weaving his fearful logic. He asked her, his wife, the companion of his journey and the intended mother of the promised heir, to tell the Egyptians she was his sister. It was a plea wrapped in a command, an act of protection that felt, even as he spoke it, like a profound betrayal, a betrayal of her, of their marriage, and of the God who had called them to a life of integrity. Sarai listened, her beautiful face unreadable. She did not protest or question. She merely looked at him, her eyes holding a deep, unspoken sorrow, and gave a single, slow nod of assent. In that moment, the unity of their purpose fractured. The journey to Egypt was no longer just a flight from famine. It became a descent into a different kind of wilderness, one of their own making, where survival would be purchased with a currency of fear and falsehood. As the caravan turned its back on the parched hills of Canaan and headed toward the green, deceptive safety of the Nile, the weight of the lie settled over them, a burden heavier than any pack or possession. Chapter 5. Abram and Sarai in Egypt. The border between the blasted wilderness and the fecund black soil of Egypt was as stark as the line between death and life. One moment, the world was a bleached expanse of rock and sand. The next, the air grew thick with the rich, muddy scent of the Nile and the overwhelming green of cultivated land. Canals, straight as arrows, cut through fields of emerald wheat and flax, shimmering with irrigation water under the intense sun. The caravan, a dusty, weary procession of desperation, was absorbed into the teeming, organized chaos of the world's greatest kingdom. The sheer scale of it was humbling. The monumental architecture, the throngs of people, the palpable power that emanated from the very ground. For Abram, the sight of such abundance was a relief that was immediately poisoned by a fresh, more potent fear. Here, his small band of nomads and their flocks were insignificant, and his most precious possession was a woman whose beauty could not be hidden by road dust or a travel-worn veil. They entered the bustling periphery of a royal city, its whitewashed walls gleaming. As they sought provisions and a place to camp, officials of the court, sharp-eyed and efficient, took note of the foreign chieftain and his entourage. Their interest, however, was not in Abram or his livestock, but in the woman who walked with a grace that transcended her weary circumstances. Sarai's beauty, honed by years of sun and wind into a timeless, regal quality, was a beacon in the crowded streets. Whispers traveled up the chain of command with the speed of a brush fire until they reached the ears of those who served Pharaoh himself. The news was simple and compelling. A woman of astonishing loveliness had arrived from the east, and she was the sister of the man who led the caravan. The summons to the palace was not a request, but a command delivered with the impersonal finality of imperial power. Abram stood before the court officials, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He repeated the carefully rehearsed lie, the half-truth that felt like a whole betrayal on his tongue. "She is my sister." The words were spoken, and with them he surrendered his wife to the gilded cage of Pharaoh's household. He watched as Sarai was led away, her posture straight and proud, but her eyes, in the single glance she cast back at him, held a depth of desolation that would haunt him for the rest of his days. In return for his sister, Abram was lavished with gifts: sheep, oxen, male and female servants, and camels. The wealth he had sought to preserve his family was granted to him as a bride price, each new acquisition a heavier weight of shame upon his soul. Inside the palace, Sarai was installed in the women's quarters, surrounded by luxuries she had never known. The air was perfumed with lotus and myrrh, and cool water flowed in channels through the gardens. Yet she was a prisoner in a gilded hall, her true identity a secret that festered in the opulent silence. Meanwhile, a shadow fell over the house of Pharaoh. It began subtly, a strange lassitude among the servants, a mysterious blight on the livestock. Then more overt afflictions descended, sores that broke out on the skin of the courtiers, a pervasive sickness that defied the priest's incantations and the physician's remedies. The plagues were not random acts of nature. They were targeted, deliberate, a divine defense of a covenant that Abram had sought to protect through deceit. The atmosphere in the royal court grew thick with dread and superstition. The priests of Egypt's many gods scried and sacrificed, but found no cause, no offended deity from their own pantheon to account for the escalating calamities. It was through this fog of divine retribution that the truth was finally unveiled. Perhaps a terrified servant, knowing the foreign woman's arrival coincided with the troubles, spoke out of turn. Perhaps Pharaoh himself, in a moment of desperate clarity, connected the afflictions that targeted his household directly to the beautiful woman he had taken. However it happened, the revelation struck the Egyptian king with the force of a physical blow. He sent for Abram, and the patriarch stood once more in the throne room, but this time the atmosphere was charged with a royal fury colder than any desert night. Pharaoh's voice, when he spoke, was low and seething, each word a carefully placed stone of condemnation. "What is this you have done to me?" he demanded, his gaze piercing through Abram's defenses. "Why did you say, 'She is my sister,' so that I took her for my wife? Now then, here is your wife. Take her and go." The rebuke was public, humiliating, and entirely justified. The most powerful man in the known world had been chastened and afflicted by Abram's God because of a lie. In that moment, Abram was not a chosen patriarch, but a corrected servant, his faith exposed as flawed, his methods found wanting. The lesson was as clear as the plagues that had preceded it. The God who had called him required honesty, even in the face of mortal peril. His protection was not earned through clever deception, but granted through unwavering trust. Abram was not cast out in disgrace, but escorted from the kingdom under armed guard, a clear indication that his presence was no longer tolerated. He left Egypt with Sarai restored to his side, and his wealth vastly increased, the herds and servants given by Pharaoh now trailing behind his caravan. But the material gain was a hollow victory. The journey back toward Canaan was a quiet, introspective one. The memory of Sarai's desolate look and Pharaoh's stinging rebuke played over in his mind, a painful tutorial in the nature of true faith. He had learned that the promise of God was not a fragile thing that needed his desperate, duplicitous protection. It was a covenant upheld by divine power, a power that could send plagues upon a kingdom to shield the one who was its intended vessel. He returned to the promised land not just wealthier, but wiser, carrying the hard-won knowledge that the integrity of his walk was as important as the destination to which he was being led. Chapter 6. Return to Canaan. The road back to Canaan was a path of penitence and reflection, each step a silent reckoning with the consequences of fear. The caravan that wound its way north from the Egyptian border was vastly different from the one that had fled the famine. Now it was a procession of abundance, a river of wealth flowing in their wake. Herds of cattle and flocks of sheep, gifts from a chastened Pharaoh, dotted the landscape in such numbers they seemed to drink the horizons dry. Servants, both those who had journeyed with them from Haran and the new faces acquired in Egypt, moved with a bustling efficiency, their voices a constant hum beneath the wide, empty sky. Camels, those stately ships of the desert, swayed under loads of silver, gold, and finely woven Egyptian linens, their exotic forms a stark contrast to the familiar donkeys and sheep. The wealth was tangible, a heavy, glittering proof of their survival, yet it felt like a weight upon Abram's soul. Each piece of silver a reminder of the price at which it had been gained. Sarai rode in silence, her gaze fixed on the receding memory of the Nile's green ribbon. The opulent prison of Pharaoh's palace had left no visible mark upon her, but a new stillness had settled in her eyes, a reserve that had not been there before. She was restored to him, her honor and their marriage covenant intact by the sheer terrifying grace of God, but a subtle distance had grown between them, a chasm carved by his failure of faith. Lot, meanwhile, surveyed the expanding wealth with a covetous, burning ambition. His own flocks and herds had multiplied alongside his uncle's, and he saw in this new-found prosperity not a lesson in divine deliverance, but an opportunity for personal power. The tension of their journey was no longer the threat of starvation, but the quiet friction of shame, silence, and burgeoning greed. When the familiar hills of Canaan at last rose on the horizon, they appeared not as a welcoming embrace, but as a silent jury. The land was still gripped by the tail end of the famine, its colors muted, its earth thirsty. They traveled north, retracing their steps through the places where God had first spoken his promises, until they came once more to the place between Bethel and Ai. It was here, at the very altar he had built upon his first arrival in the land, that Abram's journey felt complete. The stones of the altar stood as they had been left, a silent, enduring testament to a purer faith, a faith that had not yet been tested by the fear of Pharaoh or the lure of a lie. Abram did not immediately set about enlarging his camp or counting his new riches. Instead, he went alone to the altar. The sight of it, weathered and steadfast, undid him. He fell to his knees, the dry, cracked earth biting into his skin. The memory of his deception in Egypt washed over him, the calculating fear, the hollow words, the sight of Sarai being led away, the humiliating rebuke from a pagan king. He had sought to protect the promise with his own cunning, and in doing so had nearly shattered it. His prayers were not eloquent petitions, but raw, guttural outpourings of remorse and gratitude. He confessed his failure not to a distant judgmental deity, but to the God who had plagued a kingdom for his sake, the God who had defended the covenant when he, its bearer, had faltered. It was a worship born of brokenness, a reaffirmation forged in the fires of his own mistake. He called for his servants, and they brought him a flawless young ram from the new flocks. The act of sacrifice, the familiar ritual of blood and smoke, became a profound act of reconsecration. As he laid his hands upon the animal's head, he felt the weight of Egypt lift from his shoulders. As the knife did its work and the fire consumed the offering, it was not just the ram that was being given up, but Abram's own reliance on his own schemes. The smoke that curled heavenward carried with it his repentance and his renewed pledge. He was once again Abram of the altar, not Abram of the Egyptian court. He was a man who had stumbled, but who had been led back to the only source of his identity and his hope. The promise of the land and the descendants was still before him, unbroken, its fulfillment dependent not on his perfect conduct, but on the perfect faithfulness of the one who had made it. Standing before the altar at Bethel, surrounded by the wealth that was both a blessing and a reminder, Abram's faith was no longer a naive assumption. It was a hard-won conviction, tempered in failure and restored by grace, ready to face the trials that the land of promise still held. Chapter 7. Separation from Lot. The wealth that had been a source of solemn reflection for Abram became a catalyst for conflict among those who followed him. The land around Bethel, still recovering from the long drought, could not sustain the immense herds that now crowded its pastures. The once plentiful grasses were cropped down to the roots, and the few reliable water sources became crowded, muddy battlegrounds. The tension that had simmered quietly on the return from Egypt now boiled over into open strife. Abram's herdsmen, seasoned men who had followed him from Ur and through the wilderness, viewed the land and its resources as part of the divine promise granted to their master. Lot's herdsmen, younger, more aggressive, and fired by their master's ambition, saw the same pastures as prizes to be won through strength and determination. The arguments began as terse exchanges over a particular watering hole or a patch of grazing land, but they soon escalated into shouted confrontations, the air thick with accusations and the threat of violence. The unity of the clan, a fragile thing woven from shared journeys and shared hardship, was unraveling at the seams. Abram observed the discord with a heavy heart. He saw the hardened looks on the faces of his men and the restless energy in Lot's camp. The sounds of quarreling carried to his tent, a dissonant chorus that drowned out the peace he had so recently reclaimed at the altar. This was not the legacy he wished to build. The promise was one of blessing, not of strife, of a future nation, not a fractured household. He knew the source of the problem was not the land itself, but the sheer volume of their possessions and the contrasting spirits that guided their management. His own heart, chastened by Egypt, sought peace and reliance on God. Lot's heart, untested and hungry, sought expansion and personal gain. To continue together was to court disaster, to allow the seed of conflict to grow into a tree of lasting enmity. He sent a messenger to summon his nephew. Lot arrived, his posture confident, his eyes bright with the certainty of his own rights. He expected a negotiation, a drawing of boundaries, a forceful assertion of his claims. Instead, Abram offered him a gift of unimaginable generosity. Standing on a high ridge between Bethel and Ai, with the whole of the land spread out before them like a map of possibilities, Abram gestured to the vast panorama. He spoke not as a superior dictating terms, but as a kinsman pleading for peace. He declared that there should be no strife between them, for they were family. He presented Lot with a choice that reversed the natural order of authority. The entire land lay before him. Let Lot choose which direction he would take. If Lot went to the left, Abram would go to the right. If Lot chose the right, Abram would take the left. It was an act of profound self-abnegation, a surrender of the elder's right to choose, rooted in a faith that the God who had given him the land would provide for him wherever he was led. Lot, his ambition blinding him to the grace of the offer, did not hesitate. His eyes scanned the horizon, bypassing the rocky hills of the central ridge and the drier pastures to the west. They locked onto the eastern expanse, the circle of the Jordan Valley. Even from this distance, its fertility was legendary. It was well watered everywhere, a green jewel compared to the dustier hues of the highlands, a place like the garden of the Lord himself, a land of rich soil and abundant harvests that evoked the lost paradise of Eden. It was also the land of the cities of the plain, places like Sodom and Gomorrah, whose wealth was as notorious as their moral decay. But Lot saw only the immediate advantage, the lush fields that could support his vast herds and accelerate his rise to prominence. He saw a shortcut to prosperity, and he took it without a second thought, without a word of thanks for his uncle's stunning magnanimity. He chose for himself the entire Jordan Valley, and he journeyed eastward, his herds and tents and people flowing like a river toward the promise of easy abundance, drawing ever closer to the shadow of Sodom. Abram watched him go, the dust from Lot's caravan hanging in the still air like a pall. He was left with the land Lot had rejected, the stony rolling hills of Canaan. It was a harder land, a land that demanded resilience and patience, a land of faith rather than sight. As he stood alone on the ridge, the silence that descended was profound. The arguments were over, the tension dissipated, but so was the company of his nephew, the last tangible link to his former life in Haran. A profound loneliness settled over him, the cost of his peacemaking. He had traded the fertile valley for the rocky hill country, the company of family for the solitude of faith. He had placed the well-being of the covenant community above his own personal advantage, trusting that the God of the promise was not confined to the geography of the Jordan Valley. He turned from the eastern view and looked out over the land that was now solely his to steward, a land that seemed emptier and more challenging than ever, and he waited. Chapter 8. God's promise to Abram. The silence left in Lot's wake was a palpable presence, settling over the hills of Canaan like a heavy mantle. The quarrels that had fractured the air were gone, the constant lowing of his nephew's vast herds, now a distant memory carried away on the eastern winds. Abram stood alone on the high ridge, the solitary patriarch of a diminished household, the rocky, sun-baked terrain stretching before him seeming suddenly vaster and more desolate. He had traded the lush, well-watered paradise of the Jordan Valley for this, a land of thorns and flinty soil, a choice that had secured peace, but at the cost of visible prosperity. The emptiness echoed the hollow space in his own heart, a loneliness for the familial bond now stretched, thin by distance and differing ambition. He watched the last of the dust from Lot's caravan dissolve into the haze, a man standing at the precipice of his faith, having given up the tangible for the intangible, the immediate for the eternal. In that profound quiet, as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in hues of fire and gold, the voice of God came to him once more. It was not a rebuke for his loneliness, nor a questioning of his costly generosity. It was a reaffirmation, a promise so vast it seemed to fill the very emptiness around him. The Lord told him to lift up his eyes from the stony ground at his feet and to look north and south, east and west. And as Abram obeyed, his gaze sweeping across the rolling hills, the shadowed valleys, the distant mountains shimmering in the late afternoon light, the divine voice declared that all the land he could see, every rock, every thorn bush, every hidden spring and barren height, would be given to him and to his offspring forever. It was a deed written not on parchment, but on the horizon itself, a promise as boundless as his field of vision. But the promise did not stop with the land. The voice continued, weaving a future from the threads of Abram's present solitude. He was to look not only at the land, but to consider his own legacy. He, a man advancing in years with no son to bear his name, was promised descendants as countless as the dust of the earth. The very soil he had chosen, The gritty, unpromising earth beneath his worn sandals was transformed into a metaphor for a multitude. If a man could number the particles of dust, then so could his offspring be numbered. The words painted a picture in his mind of a teeming, innumerable nation, a people springing from his own loins, filling this very land with their voices, their lives, their worship. It was an impossible promise, a laughable prospect, given his age and Sarai's barrenness. Yet it was spoken with an authority that made the impossible feel inevitable. A profound shift occurred within Abram's spirit. The loneliness did not vanish, but it was overshadowed by a dawning, awe-filled hope. The God who had called him from Ur, who had chastened him in Egypt, and who had now honored his selfless act, was not a distant deity dispensing abstract blessings. He was a God who saw him, who knew the ache of his childlessness and the cost of his peace, and who responded not with sympathy, but with a covenant that stretched to the edges of the earth and the end of time. The trust that had been tested and refined now settled into a deeper, more resilient form. It was no longer a desperate gamble, but steady reliance on a character that had proven faithful. Driven by this surge of gratitude and renewed conviction, Abram did what he had always done at the pivotal moments of his journey. He did not commission a monument of carved stone or build a fortified settlement to claim his territory. He gathered the common, unhewn stones of the land, the very dust that now symbolized his future. His hands, gnarled and strong, worked with a purposeful reverence, building a simple altar to the Lord on that high ridge between Bethel and Ai. It was an act of taking possession not by force, but by faith. As the stones were stacked, each one was a silent amen to the promise, a physical declaration that he believed the one who had spoken. When he offered a sacrifice, the smoke rose into the twilight, a fragrant plea and a proclamation of trust. The altar stood as a permanent marker in the landscape of his soul, a testament that even when the promise seemed most distant, when the land felt empty and the future uncertain, he was held by a promise and known by a God who saw not what was, but what would be. He was a childless father of nations, a landless owner of a country, a man who walked not by sight, but by the sure and certain word of his God. Chapter 9. Rescue of Lot. The shadow of Sodom stretched long and corrupt, its influence seeping like a slow poison into the fertile plains Lot had so eagerly claimed. The peace Abram had purchased with his generosity was shattered not by internal strife, but by the thunder of foreign armies. A rebellion of vassal kings against the powerful Kedorlaomer of Elam erupted into a brutal, sweeping war that consumed the cities of the plain. The clash of bronze and the screams of the dying echoed through the Jordan Valley, a harvest of violence reaped from the fields of wickedness. When the smoke cleared, the forces of Sodom and Gomorrah were routed, their cities plundered, their people taken as spoils of war. And among the captured, dragged in chains with the rest of the wretched spoils, was Lot, his dreams of prosperity and comfort now replaced by the grim reality of slavery and an uncertain, likely short, future in a foreign land. The news traveled on the frantic, dust-choked feet of a lone survivor, a man who had escaped the slaughter and fled to the highlands of Hebron, where Abram was camped by the great trees of Mamre. The messenger stumbled into the camp, his clothes torn, his eyes wide with the horror he had witnessed. He fell before Abram, gasping out the tale of the battle, the plunder, and the capture of the patriarch's nephew. The words struck Abram with the force of a physical blow. The memory of his last sight of Lot, proud, ambitious, turning his back on the rocky hills for the easy wealth of the valley, flashed before him. Any resentment he might have harbored evaporated in an instant, replaced by a fierce, protective resolve. Lot was family. The bond of blood, however strained, was a sacred tether that could not be broken by distance or disagreement. Abram's mind, once clouded by fear in Egypt, was now preternaturally clear. This was not a crisis to be met with deception, but with decisive action rooted in the strength God provided. He did not pray for a miracle to strike the enemy from a distance. He understood that his own God-given resources were the instruments of deliverance. He summoned his allies, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre, and together they marshaled the fighting men born in his own household, 318 trained and loyal warriors. This was not a ragtag band of shepherds, but a disciplined force, hardened by life in a demanding land and united by their allegiance to the patriarch and his God. With his allies and their men, the small army moved with a swift, determined purpose. They did not wait for a favorable omen or a divine sign. They moved in the confidence that the cause was just, and the God of justice was with them. Their pursuit was a grueling forced march north, following the trail of devastation left by the victorious army. They tracked them all the way to Dan, a distant northern outpost, and then, in a daring night maneuver, Abram divided his forces. While one group created a distraction, he led the main body in a silent, relentless assault on the unsuspecting camp. The attack was a whirlwind of controlled chaos. The Elamites and their allies, weighed down by plunder and captives and flushed with their recent victory, were caught completely unprepared. In the darkness, confused by the sudden, coordinated attack from multiple sides, their discipline shattered. Abram's men, fighting with the ferocity of those rescuing their own, cut through the enemy lines. The night was filled with the ring of sword on shield, the shouts of men, and the panicked cries of the captured. By dawn, the battle was over. The enemy was in full flight, their kingly coalition broken, their spoils abandoned. Abram stood amidst the wreckage of the camp, the rising sun illuminating a scene of deliverance. There, among the huddled, terrified captives, was Lot, unharmed. The chains that had bound him were struck away, and he was restored to his uncle, his face a mixture of shock, shame, and overwhelming relief. Not only was Lot freed, but all the people of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their possessions were recovered. The victory was total, a stunning reversal wrought by faith and courage. On the return journey, they were met by two kings. The first was the king of Sodom, slinking out from his hiding place to greet the returning hero in the valley of Shaveh. His gratitude was laced with a transactional air. He offered Abram all the recovered goods, wanting only his people returned. But Abram's eyes had been opened. He had seen the corrupting influence of Sodom's wealth on his nephew, and he had learned in Egypt that blessing came from God alone, not from the hands of pagan kings. With a firm and solemn dignity, he refused. He raised his hand and swore an oath to the Lord, the God Most High, that he would not take so much as a thread or a sandal strap from the king of Sodom, lest the wicked king should later boast, "I made Abram rich." His wealth and his victory were gifts from God, and he would not allow their source to be misattributed. Every recovered sheep, every piece of silver was returned. The true prize was not the plunder, but the rescued life of his nephew and the undeniable glory given to the God who had delivered him. Chapter 10. Meeting with Melchizedek, the dust of battle had not yet settled. The metallic scent of blood and sweat still hanging thick in the air of the valley of Shaveh, when a different kind of presence approached Abram's victorious camp. It was not the furtive, grateful shuffle of the king of Sodom, but a procession of quiet dignity. At its head walked a figure who seemed to command the very air around him, a man whose authority was not derived from armies or conquered cities, but from a source as ancient and profound as the hills themselves. This was Melchizedek, king of Salem and priest of God Most High. He brought out bread and wine, simple, elemental sustenance that spoke of communion and blessing rather than the spoils of war. His arrival was an interruption of the mundane, a divine punctuation to the day's bloody victory, a reminder that a greater power had presided over the clash of swords. Abram, still humming with the adrenaline of the fight and the righteous defiance of his refusal to Sodom's king, felt the atmosphere shift. The clamor of the camp, the lowing of recovered livestock, the murmured relief of the freed captives, all of it faded into a hushed reverence as Melchizedek drew near. The priest-king's eyes held a deep, unsettling knowledge, as if he could see past the grime and gore of the battle to the faith that had motivated it. He did not congratulate Abram on his military prowess or his tactical genius. Instead, he lifted his hands and his voice to the heavens, and he blessed Abram in the name of God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. The words were not a simple well-wishing. They were a potent, priestly declaration, an affirmation that the victory was not Abram's alone, but a deliverance wrought by the hand of the Almighty. He praised God, who had delivered Abram's enemies into his hand, attributing the success to its true source and sanctifying the violence by placing it within the context of divine justice and protection. In that moment, standing before this mysterious mediator of the divine, Abram felt the final vestiges of his own pride and self-reliance dissolve. The blessing washed over him, a cleansing tide that purified the stain of battle from his soul. It was a confirmation that his faith, his risky pursuit, and his refusal of pagan wealth had been seen and honored by heaven itself. This was not a transaction with a nervous local ruler, but a sacred encounter with a representative of the very God who had called him from Ur. The response that swelled within him was as instinctive as it was profound. It was an act of worship, of recognition, of acknowledging the supreme sovereignty of the God Melchizedek served. Turning to his servants, Abram gave a quiet command. From the vast recovered spoils, the glittering piles of silver, the bundles of rich garments, the herds and flocks that represented the wealth of 5 kingdoms, he did not take a portion for himself. Instead, he selected 1/10 of everything. It was a calculated, significant portion, a tithe offered not out of obligation, but from an overflowing heart of gratitude and submission. He presented this 1/10 to Melchizedek, the priest of God. This was not a payment for the blessing, it was a symbolic act of giving back to God what was already his. It was Abram's way of declaring that all he had, even the fruits of his own courage and the strength of his own arm, ultimately belonged to the Creator. In giving the tithe to this priest, he was acknowledging a divine order, a hierarchy of loyalty, where God was supreme. The wealth that had been used as a test by the king of Sodom became, in this act, an instrument of worship. The meeting was brief, the exchange simple, but its implications echoed through the rest of Abram's life and far beyond. It was a moment where faith, victory, and provision converged, sanctified by a blessing and sealed with a gift, a quiet testament that the truest battles are won not on the field of combat, but in the heart's submission to the God who provides. Chapter 11, God's Covenant, the echo of Melchizedek's blessing, lingered in Abram's spirit long after the king of Salem had departed, a sacred resonance that seemed to purify the very air he breathed. The triumph of the battle, the defiant refusal of Sodom's wealth, the priestly affirmation, all of it had woven together into a single, unshakable truth. The God he served was active, present, and sovereign over every circumstance. Yet, in the quiet watches of the night, as he sat before his tent under the vast black expanse of the Canaanite sky, a different, more intimate fear began to whisper. It was the old familiar ache, the hollow space that all his victories and wealth could not fill. He was a man of immense possessions and burgeoning reputation, a power in the land, but he had no son. The promise of descendants as numerous as the dust of the earth felt in these solitary moments like a cruel taunt. The legacy he was building would have no one to inherit it. The covenant seemed to hinge on an impossibility, a biological dead end embodied in his own aging body and Sarai's barren womb. It was in this state of vulnerable contemplation, his faith both strengthened by recent events and strained by this enduring personal sorrow, that the word of the Lord came to him again. But this was not a voice in a vision or a distant command. It was a presence that enveloped him, a divine assurance that spoke directly to the core of its anxiety. "Do not be afraid, Abram," the voice began, a comfort that immediately stilled the frantic beating of his heart. "I am your shield, your very great reward." The words dismantled his deepest fears in one breath. He was not unprotected, and his reward was not a thing to be acquired, but a person to be known. His value and his security were not in the sons he could produce, but in the God who promised them. Yet the human longing remained. From the depths of his honesty, Abram gave voice to the pain that had become his constant companion. He looked out from his tent, not at the stars, but at the dark, empty space of his own future. "O sovereign Lord," he whispered into the night, "what can you give me since I remain childless?" The question hung in the air, heavy with a lifetime of waiting. He even voiced the bleak contingency plan that had formed in his mind, the idea that a servant born in his household, Eliezer of Damascus, would become his heir. It was a logical, practical solution, a way to salvage a name from the wreckage of a broken promise. It was the sigh of a man trying to reconcile an eternal covenant with a mortal, failing body. God's response was immediate and utterly dismissive of human logic. "This man will not be your heir," he declared, leaving no room for negotiation. "But a son coming from your own body will be your heir." The promise was made specific, personal, and breathtakingly impossible. Then, as if to shatter the confines of Abram's limited imagination, God drew his gaze upward. "Look up at the heavens and count the stars, if indeed you can count them." Abram lifted his eyes. The sky, which a moment before had been a blanket of oppressive darkness, was now a breathtaking tapestry of infinite light. Pinpricks of silver, swirls of distant galaxies, countless points of fire against the velvet black, each one seemed to pulse with the voice of God. "So shall your offspring be," the voice concluded, weaving the impossible promise into the fabric of the cosmos itself. The shift within Abram was not a slow dawning, but a seismic realignment of his entire being. The evidence of his eyes, his aged frame, Sarai's barrenness, collapsed under the weight of the divine declaration. The countless stars were not just a metaphor. They were a testimony to the power of the one who had hung them in place. To believe the promise was to believe in the promiser. And in that moment, staring into the infinite, Abram chose to stake his entire existence on the character of God. He believed the Lord. This belief, this raw, unreserved trust in the face of the impossible, was not merely noted by God. It was accounted to him as righteousness. It was a legal, cosmic transaction. In the divine ledger, Abram's faith was recorded not as a feeling or a hopeful sentiment, but as right standing. His trust became the currency that purchased a righteousness he could never earn, a holiness he could never achieve. The covenant was not just a promise about land and descendants. It was a relationship founded on this imputed righteousness, a bond sealed by faith itself. The man who had nothing to show for the promise but his trust was declared right with God. He stood there, under the star-dusted sky, a childless father of nations, a righteous man not by deed, but by belief. His soul quieted, and his future secured by a covenant written in light. Chapter 12. Hagar and Ishmael. The years stretched across the plains of Canaan like a long, dry season, each one adding another layer of dust to the unfulfilled promise. The divine covenant, sealed under the canopy of stars, felt increasingly like a dream from a forgotten youth. Abram's hair grayed at his temples, and the lines on his face deepened, etching the passage of time into his skin. Sarai, once a woman of radiant beauty, now carried a different kind of weight in her eyes, a heavy, silent sorrow that no amount of wealth or security could lift. Her tent, for all its fine Egyptian linens and chests of silver, was a monument to emptiness. The laughter of children was a sound that belonged to other households, a constant aching reminder of the one thing her status and her husband's faith could not provide. The promise of a son had become a thorn in her heart, a divine pledge that seemed to mock her barrenness with every passing moon. Her gaze often fell upon her Egyptian maidservant, Hagar. Young, strong, and fertile, Hagar moved through the camp with an unconscious vitality that was both a comfort and a provocation to her mistress. A desperate, pragmatic plan began to take root in Sarai's mind, a human solution to a divinely imposed delay. It was an ancient custom, a way to build a family through a surrogate, and in her despair, it seemed like the only thread of hope left to grasp. She went to Abram, her voice tight, with a resolve born of long frustration. She presented her case not as a request, but as a logical conclusion. The Lord had prevented her from bearing children. Perhaps He intended the promise to be fulfilled through another. She offered Hagar to him, so that she might obtain children through her. It was an act of surrender and of control, a relinquishing of her own role in the covenant in exchange for a tangible outcome. Abram, weary of the waiting and sensitive to his wife's profound grief, listened to Sarai's words. The starry promise felt distant, and the sight of Sarai's pain was an immediate, pressing reality. He agreed. The union was a transaction, devoid of the joy and intimacy that should accompany the creation of a new life. Hagar, the instrument of their hope, was given to Abram's tent, and in the following weeks the truth became evident. She was with child. The news should have been a cause for jubilation, a crack of light in the long darkness, but instead it introduced a new and bitter poison into the household. The pregnancy changed Hagar. The quiet, subordinate maidservant began to look upon her mistress with a new, unsettling expression. It was not outright defiance, but a subtle, contemptuous pride that flickered in her eyes. She, the Egyptian slave, had achieved what the great lady Sarai could not. The life growing within her was not just a child. It was a vindication, a shifting of the invisible scales of power within the tent. Sarai, who had initiated the plan, now found herself its first victim. The contempt she saw in Hagar's gaze was a torment more exquisite than her barrenness. The solution had become a deeper problem, the hoped-for heir a source of daily humiliation. The conflict, simmering in silent glances and withheld courtesies, finally erupted. Sarai confronted Abram, her voice sharp with a fury born of wounded pride and betrayal. "This wrong done to me is your responsibility," she accused. "I put my servant in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." She placed the entire messy situation at his feet, making him the arbiter of a dispute he had never wanted. Abram, caught between his wife's anguish and the complicated reality of the pregnant maidservant, sought a path of peace that only inflamed the strife. He reaffirmed Sarai's authority. "Your servant is in your hands," he said. "Do with her whatever you think best." It was an abdication, a return of the problem to its source, and it gave Sarai the license she needed. The persecution began. It was not physical violence, but a relentless, cold hostility that made Hagar's position in the camp unbearable. Sarai's words became barbs, her demands impossible, her presence a constant reminder of Hagar's subordinate status. The pride that had bloomed in the maidservant's heart withered under the harsh sun of her mistress's displeasure. The tent that had been her shelter became a prison. The child in her womb, once a source of secret triumph, now felt like a burden that tied her to a life of misery. Unable to endure it any longer, Hagar fled. She did not take food or water, only the clothes on her back and the desperate, wild hope of escape. She turned her face away from the camp of Abram and ran into the vast, unforgiving wilderness, heading toward the road that led back to Egypt, to Shur. The desert was a brutal refuge. The sun hammered down on the cracked earth, and the wind scoured the landscape, offering no comfort. Her strength, fueled by adrenaline and despair, soon began to fail. Stumbling to the ground beside a spring of water along the way, she collapsed, her body trembling with exhaustion and the life stirring within her. In that moment of absolute desolation, surrounded by the immense, indifferent emptiness of the wilderness, she was utterly alone. But it was there, at her lowest point, that the angel of the Lord found her. The presence was not threatening, but profoundly real, a concentration of holy attention in the midst of the desolate waste. "Hagar, servant of Sarai," the voice addressed her, using her name and her station, acknowledging her entire, complicated story. "Where have you come from, and where are you going?" The questions were not for information, but for revelation. Through her sobs, Hagar confessed the truth. "I'm running away from my mistress Sarai." The angel's response was a command wrapped in a promise. Go back to your mistress and submit to her. It was the last thing she wanted to hear, a directive that seemed to seal her fate in misery. But the command was followed by a breathtaking prophecy that redefined her entire existence. She was told that she would have a son, and she was to name him Ishmael. For the Lord had heard of her misery, and this son would not be a mere servant, but a wild, untamable force. He would be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone and everyone's hand against him, and he would live in hostility toward all his brothers. It was a promise of strife, but also of fierce, independent survival. Most importantly, it was a promise of a legacy. Her offspring, too, would become a great nation. The God of Abram had seen her, the Egyptian slave, and had heard her affliction. Awe washed over Hagar, eclipsing her fear and self-pity. She gave a name to the Lord who had spoken to her. "You are the God who sees me," she whispered, for she said, "I have now seen the one who sees me." The spring where she had collapsed in despair was now consecrated as Bir Lahai Roi, the well of the living one who sees me. It was a personal theophany, a covenant granted not to the patriarch, but to the maidservant. Strengthened by this encounter, her destiny redefined, Hagar did as she was commanded. She turned away from the road to Egypt and walked back toward the camp of Abram. She returned to the place of her humiliation, but she was no longer the same woman. She carried within her not just the child of Abram, but the unshakable knowledge that she was seen by God. The promise of a nation was now nestled in her womb, a testament that divine plans often unfold in the most unexpected and humanly fraught of ways, through the struggles of the overlooked and the desperate. Chapter 13, Covenant of Circumcision. The weight of the promise had settled into the very bones of the household, a tension between the miraculous words spoken under the stars and the unyielding reality of aging bodies. Abram was 99 years old, a patriarch whose life was a tapestry woven with threads of divine encounter and human frailty. The memory of Hagar's flight and return, of Ishmael's vigorous childhood, was a constant, complicated reminder that human efforts to fulfill divine promises often created their own webs of strife and sorrow. Ishmael was 13, a living, breathing son, and yet a silent question lingered in Abram's heart. Was this wild, beloved boy the heir of the covenant, or was the promise still suspended in the realm of the impossible, waiting for a different fulfillment? It was in this season of quiet questioning that the Lord appeared to Abram once more, not as a voice in the night, but with a palpable, overwhelming presence that demanded a new level of consecration. The divine voice cut through the years of waiting with a declaration of sovereign authority. "I am God Almighty," the voice began, a title that spoke of limitless power, of a might that could shatter biological clocks and reverse the decay of years. "Walk before me faithfully and be blameless." The command was a call to a life of unwavering integrity, a life lived in the conscious, moment-by-moment awareness of the divine gaze. Then came the renewal of the covenant, but this time it was sealed with a new, irrevocable sign. The first act of this renewed covenant was a change of identity. "No longer will you be called Abram," the voice declared, "but your name will be Abraham, for I have made you a father of many nations." The addition of the breathy ha sound transformed exalted Father into Father of a multitude. It was a name that prophesied his future, a new identity to be worn by faith long before its reality was visible. Sarai, too, was renamed. She was to be called Sarah, princess, for she would be the mother of nations, and kings of peoples would come from her. The promise was now explicitly, undeniably tied to her, the barren wife, the woman past the age of childbearing. The idea was so preposterous that Abraham, the father of nations, fell face down and laughed inwardly. Will a son be born to a man 100 years old? Will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? The laughter was not of mockery, but of bewildered, astonished disbelief at the sheer, impossible scope of God's plan. God's response was firm and clear. Yes, Sarah would bear a son, and he was to be named Isaac. He laughs. The covenant would be established with Isaac, the son of promise, born of Sarah. But God's compassion also extended to Ishmael. He too would be blessed, made fruitful, and become a great nation. Yet the eternal covenant, the promise of the land, and the lineage through which all nations would be blessed, would pass through Isaac, the son yet unconceived. Then God instituted the physical sign of this everlasting covenant, a mark that would set Abraham and his descendants apart from all other peoples. Every male among them, whether born in the household or bought with money from a foreigner, was to be circumcised. The flesh of their foreskins was to be cut off, a permanent, intimate mark in their very bodies. It was a sign of the covenant between God and Abraham and his offspring for the generations to come. The act itself was one of profound symbolism, a cutting away of the flesh, a mark of purification and consecration, a permanent reminder that the promise of descendants was a gift from God, not an achievement of human potency. It was to be performed on the 8th day of a boy's life, incorporating each new generation into the sacred community. From its earliest days, the command was absolute, and Abraham's response was immediate and total. There was no hesitation, no period of consultation or debate. On that very day, as God had spoken to him, Abraham took his son Ishmael and every male in his household, including those born there and those bought with money from foreigners. With a steady hand and a heart full of obedient faith, he circumcised the flesh of their foreskins. The pain of the ritual was a tangible expression of the cost of the covenant, a physical submission to the divine will. Abraham, at 99 years old, also took the flint knife to his own flesh, bearing the sign himself, a patriarch leading his household not just in word, but in vulnerable, painful action. The camp was quiet in the aftermath, a community united by a shared physical token of their unique relationship with God. The obedience was complete, a demonstration of faith that went beyond intellectual assent to transformative action. The covenant was no longer just a promise whispered in the night or written in the stars. It was now etched into the flesh of every male in Abraham's household, a permanent, painful, and powerful reminder that they were a people set apart, chosen by God Almighty to walk before Him, blameless, waiting for the laughter of a promised son to become the joyful cry of a miraculous birth. Chapter 14, Visitors Promise a Son. The heat of the day was a heavy blanket, pressing down upon the plains of Mamre until the very air seemed to shimmer and dance. Abraham sat at the entrance of his tent, seeking what little relief the shade of the great terebinth trees could offer. His old bones ached with the familiar weariness of his years, but his eyes, still sharp, scanned the horizon with the habitual watchfulness of a nomad. It was then that he saw them, 3 figures emerging from the heat haze, their forms solidifying as they drew nearer. They moved with a purpose that was neither hurried nor meandering, their presence an anomaly in the drowsy stillness of the afternoon. A strange quickening stirred in Abraham's spirit, an instinct deeper than hospitality, a recognition that this was no ordinary encounter. He did not wait for them to approach his tent. He rose to his feet and ran to meet them, his aged limbs finding a sudden, surprising agility. Bowing low to the ground, he addressed the one who seemed to be the leader, his voice imbued with the profound respect of the East. He did not plead with them to stay. He entreated them, offering the simple, sacred comforts of shade, water, and bread, a chance to rest their feet before they continued their journey. When they agreed, Abraham's movements became a flurry of purposeful activity. He hurried into the tent where Sarah was resting and instructed her to take the finest flour and knead it quickly into cakes. Then he ran to the herd and selected a tender, choice calf, which he gave to a servant, who hurried to prepare it. He brought them curds and milk and the tender veal he had prepared, setting it before them as they reclined beneath the tree. He did not recline with them, but stood near them under the tree, a servant to his guests, his watchful presence a testament to his role as host. The meal was consumed in a silence that felt charged, a quietude more profound than the stillness of the day. When they had finished, the visitors turned their attention from the meal to the promise. The one who led them spoke, his voice carrying a weight of absolute authority. "Where is your wife, Sarah?" he asked. The question was intimate, piercing through the formalities of hospitality to the core of Abraham's private life. "There, in the tent," Abraham replied, a flicker of wonder in his eyes. Then came the declaration, simple, direct, and utterly impossible. "I will surely return to you about this time next year," the visitor stated, "and Sarah, your wife, will have a son." Sarah was listening at the entrance of the tent, which was behind him. The words sliced through the canvas walls as clearly as if they had been spoken inside. A sound escaped her lips, a short, sharp exhalation that was half gasp, half laugh, but it was a laugh stripped of all joy. It was the bitter, incredulous sound of a lifetime of disappointment, the hollow echo of a hope that had died and been buried under years of barrenness. She was old, her body long past the cycles of life, worn out by age and the quiet grief of unfulfillment. Abraham was old. The very thought was not just unlikely, it was a physiological absurdity, a joke told by a cruel fate. "After I am worn out and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure?" she thought to herself, the words a silent, scornful rebuttal to the divine pronouncement. Then the leader of the visitors spoke again, and this time his words were not directed at Abraham, but at the woman listening in the tent. Why did Sarah laugh and say, "Will I really have a child now that I am old?" The question hung in the air, a divine interrogation that exposed the secret thoughts of her heart. Sarah, her fear rising in a cold wave, denied it. "I did not laugh," she said from the tent, her voice trembling. But the visitor, his knowledge absolute and penetrating, corrected her gently yet firmly. "Yes, you did laugh." The rebuke was not one of anger, but of gentle, unassailable truth. It was followed by a question that resonated through the ages, a challenge to the very limits of human understanding. Is anything too hard for the Lord? The words were not a reprimand aimed solely at Sarah, but a proclamation meant for both of them, a reaffirmation that anchored the impossible promise in the character of the one who made it. The promise was reiterated with a finality that brooked no argument. The visitor would return at the appointed time, and Sarah would have a son. The conversation then shifted, the visitors rising as if to continue their journey, their purpose with Abraham complete for now, their astounding promise left hanging in the air, a seed of the miraculous planted in the soil of disbelief, waiting for the appointed time to break open and grow. Chapter 15, Destruction of Sodom. The lingering presence of the three visitors was a palpable thing, a charged silence that settled over the plains of Mamre long after their forms had vanished toward the grim silhouette of Sodom. Abraham stood alone, the taste of the meal they had shared still on his tongue, the echo of their impossible promise to Sarah ringing in his ears. But a new dread now coiled in his gut, cold and sharp, for the purpose of their journey had been made clear. The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah was great, and their sin was so grievous that the Lord himself had come down to see if it was as bad as the report suggested. The two figures who had departed for the city were not mere travelers. They were divine agents of judgment, and their destination was a place of fire and brimstone. And in that city, drawn by its easy wealth and compromised morals, was Lot, his nephew. Abraham could not let the matter rest. The promise of a son was a private, glorious mystery, but the impending destruction of Sodom was a public, terrifying cataclysm that threatened to consume the one remaining link to his former life. He approached the one remaining visitor, the Lord himself, his heart pounding with a mixture of reverence and desperate audacity. "Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked?" he asked, his voice trembling. "What if there are 50 righteous people in the city? Will you really sweep it away and not spare the place for the sake of the 50 righteous people in it?" The negotiation that followed was a breathtaking display of both divine patience and human intercession. Abraham, the friend of God, pleaded with the persistence of a man who knew both the justice and the mercy of the one he addressed. He bargained the number down from 50 to 45 to 30 to 20, and finally, with a humility that bordered on terror, to 10. "For the sake of 10, I will not destroy it," the Lord agreed. And with that, the Lord departed, and Abraham returned to his place, his spirit heavy with the fragile hope that 10 righteous souls could be found in the cesspool of the plain. Meanwhile, the 2 angels arrived in Sodom at evening, finding Lot sitting in the gateway of the city, a place where the elders and judges conducted business. His presence there spoke of his assimilation, his compromise with the wickedness that surrounded him. Yet a flicker of his upbringing remained, for upon seeing the strangers, he rose to meet them and bowed with his face to the ground, urging them to spend the night in his house. His insistence was frantic, born of a knowing dread of what the night in the city square would bring. They initially declined, stating their intention to spend the night in the square. But Lot's pleas were so vehement that they finally relented and entered his home. He prepared a feast for them, but before they had even lain down, the house was surrounded by the men of the city, both young and old, every last man from every quarter. Their demand was vile and violent, a raw exhibition of the city's collective depravity. They called out to Lot, demanding that he bring the strangers out so they could have sex with them. Lot, in a moment of tragic, misguided loyalty to the codes of hospitality he had learned from Abraham, went out to the mob, closing the door behind him. His attempt to reason with them was a pathetic failure. His offer of his own virgin daughters in place of his guests was a measure of how deeply the city's corruption had infected his own moral compass. The mob only grew more aggressive, surging forward to break down the door. The angels inside acted swiftly. They reached out, pulled Lot back into the house, and struck the men at the door with blindness, so that they wearied themselves groping for the door. The judgment had begun. The angels then revealed their full purpose to Lot. They were there to destroy the place, for the outcry to the Lord against its people was so great that he had sent them to destroy it. They commanded him to gather any who belonged to him, sons-in-law, sons, daughters, anyone in the city, and get them out. Lot went to his sons-in-law, who were pledged to marry his daughters, and warned them, but his words seemed like nonsense to them, and they did not take him seriously. As dawn was breaking, the angels urged a lingering Lot to hurry, taking his wife and his 2 daughters by the hand. The Lord, in his mercy, was being gracious to them. When Lot still hesitated, the men seized his hand and the hands of his wife and 2 daughters, and led them safely out of the city. Once they were outside, the command was absolute. Flee for your lives. Don't look back, and don't stop anywhere in the plain. Flee to the mountains, or you will be swept away. Lot, ever the negotiator, pleaded for a smaller, closer town, and his request was granted. Zoar would be spared for his sake. Flee there quickly, the angel said, because I cannot do anything until you reach it. The sun had risen upon the earth when Lot entered Zoar. Then the Lord rained down burning sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah, from the Lord out of the heavens. The cataclysm was absolute. The skies themselves seemed to tear open, vomiting fire and brimstone upon the cities, upon the entire plain, and upon all those living in the cities. The earth shook with a series of deep subterranean roars as the fertile valley, once like the garden of the Lord, was overturned in a torrent of divine fury. A thick, black smoke rose from the land like the smoke from a gigantic furnace, a funeral pyre for an entire civilization. It was a thorough, terrifying exhibition of justice, an erasure of wickedness so complete that nothing would ever grow there again. But in the midst of this holocaust, mercy had its small, fragile victory. Lot and his 2 daughters were saved, spirited away to the tiny town of Zoar. Yet, even in deliverance, the corruption of Sodom left its mark. Lot's wife, her heart still tethered to the life she had known, to the possessions and the status she was leaving behind, disobeyed the one simple command. As the ground trembled and the sky rained fire, she turned and looked back. In that moment of longing for the wickedness from which she had been saved, she became a pillar of salt, a stark, crystalline monument to the peril of a divided heart, frozen forever in a posture of disobedience. Abraham, meanwhile, had risen early in the morning and returned to the place where he had stood before the Lord. He looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah, toward the entire plain of the Jordan, and he saw it, a dense smoke rising from the land, like smoke from a furnace. The sight was a confirmation of God's righteous judgment and a devastating answer to his intercession. Not even 10 righteous had been found. Yet, as the black plume stained the sky, Abraham's faith was not shattered, it was tempered. He had witnessed the absolute justice of God in the destruction of the wicked, and he had witnessed the profound mercy of God in the rescue of his nephew, a mercy he himself had pleaded for. The God of the stars and the covenant was also the God of the furnace and the rescue, a God whose ways were perfect, whose justice was terrible, and whose mercy, for those who would heed his call to flee, was as real as the fire falling from heaven. Chapter 16. Abraham and Abimelech. The memory of Sodom's fiery end was a scar upon the land and upon Abraham's soul, a permanent reminder of the terrible cost of entrenched wickedness and the breathtaking scope of divine judgment. The plains of Mamre, once a place of divine visitation and miraculous promise, now felt too close to the ashen desolation of the valley. A restless spirit moved upon Abraham, a need to put distance between his household and the ghost of that smoldering ruin. He struck his tents, gathered his vast flocks and herds, and journeyed south into the territory of the Philistines, settling in the region of Gerar. It was a land of rolling hills and fortified towns, a kingdom ruled by a king named Abimelech, a man of power and order. Yet as Abraham's caravan settled on the outskirts of Gerar, an old, familiar fear, one he had hoped was buried in the shame of Egypt, stirred from its slumber. He looked at Sarah, now a woman of 90, her beauty seemingly untouched by the decades, carrying within her the impossible, God-sworn secret of a promised son. He looked at the strong walled city of Gerar and its powerful king, and the ghost of Pharaoh's court rose before him. The lesson of Egypt, that God was his shield, felt like a theory, a distant memory overshadowed by the immediate, visceral fear of a powerful foreign ruler. The faith that had stood before God to plead for Sodom now crumbled before the prospect of a mortal king. Once again, he resorted to the desperate half-true shield that had failed him before. He instructed Sarah, his wife, the soon-to-be mother of the covenant child, to tell the people of Gerar that she was his sister. It was a catastrophic failure of nerve, a choice to protect the promise through the very deceit that had nearly destroyed it once before. King Abimelech, hearing of the beautiful woman in the camp of the wealthy Hebrew patriarch, sent for her. Sarah was taken into his household, the sequence of events mirroring the nightmare of Egypt with a dreadful familiarity. Abraham, once again, stood by as his wife was led away, the wealth and respect he had accrued in the land feeling like a hollow consolation for the integrity he had sacrificed. He was a man of altars and covenants, reduced to a fearful schemer, trusting in a lie more than in the God who had spoken to him from the heavens. But God would not allow his promise to be derailed by the recurring frailty of its vessel. That night, he came to Abimelech in a dream, a divine intrusion into the king's peace. The message was one of stark, mortal warning. "You are as good as dead," the voice declared, "because of the woman you have taken. She is a married woman." Abimelech, who had not yet gone near Sarah, protested his innocence. He had acted in good faith, believing Abraham's claim. "Lord, will you destroy an innocent nation?" he pleaded. Did he not himself say to me, She is my sister? And she herself said, He is my brother. I have done this with a clear conscience and clean hands. God acknowledged the king's integrity in the matter. Yes, I know you did this with a clear conscience, the voice replied from the dream. And so I have kept you from sinning against me. That is why I did not let you touch her. But the divine protection was conditional upon immediate and total restitution. Abimelech was commanded to return the man's wife, for he was a prophet, and he would pray for the king, and he would live. But if he did not return her, he and all who belonged to him would surely die. Abimelech rose early the next morning, the terror of the dream clinging to him. He summoned all his officials and told them everything, and the men were very much afraid. Then he summoned Abraham. The confrontation was laced with a royal fury that was colder and more controlled than Pharaoh's. "What have you done to us?" Abimelech demanded, his voice low and seething. "How have I wronged you, that you have brought such great guilt upon me and my kingdom? You have done things to me that should not be done." He laid bare the recklessness of Abraham's actions. "What was your reason for doing this?" Abraham's defense was a pathetic tapestry of fear and self-justification. He admitted his fear, stating he thought there was no fear of God in the place, and that he would be killed because of his wife. Then he offered the flimsy technicality he had clung to. "And besides," he said, "she really is my sister, the daughter of my father, though not of my mother, and she became my wife." It was a confession that exposed the calculating nature of his deceit. He had deliberately misled, using a sliver of truth to construct a whole edifice of falsehood, risking the king's life and his own wife's honor to save his own skin. Abimelech's response was one of righteous indignation. He took sheep and cattle, male and female slaves, and gave them to Abraham, publicly restoring his wealth and status as an act of restitution. And he returned Sarah to him whole and untouched. Then the king issued a sovereign decree granting Abraham the right to live anywhere in his lands. It was a stunning act of grace from the one who had been wronged. But his final words to Sarah were a public vindication of her and a final rebuke of her husband's cowardice. "I am giving your brother 1,000 shekels of silver," he told her. "This is to cover the offense against you before all who are with you. You are completely vindicated." Abraham, humbled and chastened, prayed to God. The divine lesson, repeated and amplified, had finally struck home. God had not only protected Sarah and the promise, but he had also worked through the conscience of a pagan king to correct his chosen patriarch. He healed Abimelech, his wife, and his female slaves so they could have children again, for the Lord had kept all of Abimelech's household from conceiving because of Sarah. The episode closed with Abraham once again in possession of his wife and increased in wealth, but bearing the deeper, more painful knowledge that the God of the covenant demanded a faith that operated in truth, even in the shadow of powerful kings, a faith that trusted in the divine shield more than in human schemes. Chapter 17, Birth of Isaac. The long-awaited moment arrived, not with celestial fanfare, but in the quiet, intimate confines of a goat-hair tent, where the air was thick with the scent of lamp oil and the palpable tension of a miracle in progress. The divine promise, once a laughable impossibility, whispered under the stars of Mamre, now manifested in the sharp, urgent cries of a woman in labor. Sarah, her body bent and strained with the unthinkable effort of a first birth at 90 years of age, clung to the hands of her midwives, her face a mask of pain and primal determination. Outside, Abraham paced, his own aged heart hammering against his ribs, each of Sarah's cries a painful echo of the decades of silent longing that had preceded this day. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, the entire camp suspended in a state of awe-filled anticipation, waiting for the covenant to take its first breath. Then, cutting through the groans and the murmured encouragements, came a new sound, a thin, reedy, indignant wail. It was the sound of life, of a future, of a promise fulfilled. The midwives emerged from the tent, their faces radiant with a joy that was almost fear, and presented the swaddled bundle to Abraham. He took his son into his arms, his gnarled, weathered hands trembling as they cradled the impossible. The baby's face was red and puckered, his features a perfect miniature declaration of God's faithfulness. The laughter of disbelief that had once echoed in this very tent was now transformed into the joyful weeping of a father. He looked at the child, and he named him Isaac. He laughs, a permanent testament to the divinely appointed humor of his conception and the boundless joy of his arrival. On the 8th day, in strict obedience to the covenant God had established, Abraham took a flint knife and performed the rite of circumcision on his infant son. The act was solemn and swift, a physical cutting that marked the boy as belonging irrevocably to the Lord. Isaac's sharp cry of protest was a sound Abraham welcomed, for it was the sound of the covenant being sealed in flesh, of the promise being etched into the very body of the heir. The entire household watched, their own circumcisions now given profound new meaning. This was not Ishmael, the son of human effort and impatience. This was Isaac, the child of divine intervention, the one through whom the eternal covenant would be established. Sarah's transformation was the most profound of all. The woman who had once hidden in her tent to laugh in scornful disbelief now sat in its opening, her son nursing contentedly at her breast. The lines of sorrow and bitterness that had been carved into her face by years of barrenness seemed to soften, replaced by a radiance that was more than maternal. It was the glow of vindication, of a shame lifted, of a lifelong reproach silenced forever. When her friend and the women of the camp came to visit, they did not find a weary old woman, but a queen mother. "God has brought me laughter," she declared, her voice strong and clear, "and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me." Her joy was infectious, a ripple of celebration that spread through the entire encampment, turning the plains of Mamre into a festival of divine faithfulness. The God of the stars had kept his word, and in the face of a newborn child, the long years of waiting and doubt dissolved into the pure, unassailable truth of a promise kept. Chapter 18. Weaning of Isaac. The laughter that had filled Abraham's camp since Isaac's birth reached its zenith on the day of his weaning. It was a sound that seemed to chase away the very shadows, a celebration that resonated through the terebinth trees of Mamre, a public declaration that the God of the impossible had kept his word. The boy had grown strong and robust, his first steps a wobbling dance of life that brought fresh joy to his aged parents. The feast, to mark his transition from his mother's milk to solid food, was a spectacle of abundance. The roasting scent of tender lamb and seasoned goat meat perfumed the air. Great clay jars of wine and foaming milk were passed among the throng of guests, kinsmen, allies, and servants, whose faces were alight with shared merriment. Abraham, his face crinkled in a near constant smile, moved through the crowd, his heart so full it felt like a physical pressure in his chest. This was the day he had waited for through a century of life, the tangible proof of a covenant that had once been nothing but a voice in the dark. But within the festive clamor, an older discordant note was struck. Ishmael, now a strapping adolescent of nearly 17, watched the proceedings from the edge of the celebration. The boy who had once been the sole object of his father's hope now saw himself displaced, his position as firstborn rendered void by the miraculous arrival of this laughing, favored half-brother. The adulation heaped upon Isaac, the way Abraham's eyes followed the toddler's every movement, it all curdled something within him. As the feasting reached its peak, Isaac, giddy with attention and sweet wine dabbed on his lips, stumbled in a playful game near where Ishmael stood. The older boy did not offer a hand. Instead, a short, sharp, derisive laugh escaped him, a sound utterly devoid of mirth. It was a laugh of contempt, of bitter mockery, a silent jeer aimed at the child heir and the divine folly that had produced him. Sarah saw it. Her maternal instincts, honed by a lifetime of guarding her own precarious status, were razor-sharp. Her eyes, which had so recently held only joy, narrowed into slits of cold fury. The sight of Ishmael's mocking gesture, the curl of his lip, was a spark thrown onto the dry tinder of her old resentments. It resurrected the ghost of Hagar's contempt, the years of humiliation, the bitter memory of the maidservant's fertile womb. In that single hateful glance, Sarah saw a threat to everything, to Isaac's inheritance, to his future, to the purity of the covenant itself. She would not allow the son of a slave woman to mock the son of the promise. Her joy hardened into a ruthless, protective resolve. She sought out Abraham, finding him in a quiet moment, his face still softened by the day's celebrations. Her words were not a request, but a demand, delivered with an icy finality that brooked no argument. "Get rid of that slave woman and her son," she commanded, her voice low and venomous. "That slave woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac." The words hung in the air, severing the festive atmosphere. She was not merely asking for discipline. She was demanding expulsion, a severing of the household, a permanent removal of the rival and his mother. The demand distressed Abraham greatly. It was a dagger to the heart of his paternal love. Ishmael was his son, his firstborn, the boy he had raised and loved for 17 years. The sound of Ishmael's laughter as a child, the pride in his growing strength, these were not memories so easily discarded. The thought of casting him out into the wilderness, of sending Hagar away with nothing, felt like a cruelty that violated every instinct he possessed. The unity of his family, hard-won and carefully maintained, was being torn asunder by his wife's uncompromising decree. He was trapped between his love for his firstborn and his duty to the son of the covenant, between the bonds of the past and the demands of the future. In his deep distress, he turned to the only source of counsel he trusted, and God spoke to him, his voice a calm, assuring presence in the storm of his heart. "Do not be so distressed about the boy and your slave woman," God said. "Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned." The divine confirmation was clear and unambiguous. The covenant line was to be pure, untangled from the complications of human striving. Isaac was the chosen vessel. But God's compassion, as always, reached beyond the strict boundaries of the promise. I will make the son of the slave into a nation also, he assured Abraham, because he is your offspring. The blessing would not be stripped from Ishmael. It would simply find its expression on a different path, away from the chosen heir. The assurance did not erase the pain, but it gave Abraham the strength to obey. The following morning, as the camp stirred in the aftermath of the feast, he arose with a heavy heart. He took a skin of water and some bread, a meager provision for a journey into the unknown. He went to Hagar's tent and found her and Ishmael. His words were few, his face a mask of sorrow. He placed the bread and the water skin into Hagar's hands, his own hands trembling slightly. He did not offer explanations or lengthy farewells. The divine command and Sarah's decree were the only realities that mattered now. With a final agonized look at his firstborn son, he sent them away. Hagar took the provisions, her own face a study in stoic resignation. She had known this day might come from the moment Sarah's laughter had turned to joy. She and Ishmael turned their backs on the only home they had ever known and walked away from the tents of Abraham, leaving behind the sounds of a celebration that had sealed their fate. They moved into the barren wilderness of Beersheba, two solitary figures swallowed by the immense, indifferent landscape, their future as uncertain as the shifting desert sands. Abraham watched them until they were nothing but specks on the horizon, the weight of his obedience a stone in his belly, trusting that the God who had provided a son in his old age would also provide for the son he had been forced to send away. Chapter 19. God tests Abraham. The divine voice that shattered the peace of Abraham's morning was one he had learned to both revere and dread, for it spoke with the weight of worlds and the intimacy of a father. This time, however, the command it carried was a blade aimed at the very core of his being, a test so severe it seemed to tear at the fabric of the covenant itself. "Take your son," the voice began, each word falling with the terrible precision of a hammer on anvil. "Your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." The words did not simply hang in the air. They entered Abraham's soul and took root, a chilling, impossible imperative that demanded the surrender of the one thing that gave all his other sacrifices meaning. Isaac was not just a son. He was the laughter of God, the living, breathing proof of a promise kept, the heir through whom nations would rise. To sacrifice him was to extinguish the future, to reduce the covenant to ashes on an altar. A lesser faith would have shattered, would have argued, would have pleaded the insanity of the command. But Abraham's faith had been forged in the fires of 100 smaller obediences, tempered by years of walking with a God whose ways were often inscrutable, but whose faithfulness was absolute. The command felt like a death, but his trust in the commander was a deeper, more resilient force. In the profound, silent chamber of his heart, a terrible peace settled. He did not wake Sarah. He could not bear to see the light in her eyes extinguished by the horror of his mission. In the gray pre-dawn light, he moved with a grim, methodical purpose that belied the tempest raging within. He saddled his donkey, his hand steady on the familiar leather, He called 2 of his most trusted young servants to accompany him. Then he went to the tent where Isaac still slept, the boy's face peaceful in the soft light, his breath a gentle rhythm of untroubled innocence. With a touch that was both a caress and a farewell, Abraham woke his son. The journey to Moriah was a 3-day funeral procession disguised as a pilgrimage. Each step of the donkey, each scuff of their sandals on the stony path was a measured beat toward an unthinkable conclusion. Abraham's gaze was fixed on the horizon, his face a mask of granite, but his eyes held a deep, unfathomable sorrow. He spoke little, his silence a wall against the questions he knew would come. Isaac, initially excited by the adventure, soon sensed the heavy pall over his father. The usual stories of God's promises were absent. The air was thick with a dread that even the bright sunlight could not dispel. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance, the mountain of Moriah rising against the sky, its summit a stark, accusing finger. He stopped then and turned to the 2 young servants. "Stay here with the donkey," he instructed, his voice strangely calm. "The boy and I will go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." The words were a confession of a faith that defied logic. "We will come back to you." He did not know how, but he believed it. He believed that the God who could give life to a dead womb could also restore life to a dead son. He believed that even on the other side of obedience, there was a provision he could not yet see. He took the wood for the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac's young shoulders. He himself carried the fire and the knife. The 2 of them, father and son, walked on together, the only sound the crunch of their feet on the path and the rustle of the wood. It was Isaac who finally broke the heavy silence, his young voice clear and trusting. "Father?" he said. "Yes, my son," Abraham replied, the term of endearment a fresh wound. "The fire and wood are here," Isaac said, his logic innocent and piercing, "but where's the lamb for the burnt offering?" The question hung between them, a perfect, agonizing summary of the test. Abraham's heart must have felt like it was being torn in 2. He looked at his son, the promised child, the laughter of his old age, and in that moment his faith found its purest, most powerful expression. He did not explain the horror. He did not confess the divine command. He spoke a truth that went beyond his present circumstances, a prophecy born of desperate trust. "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the 2 of them went on together, climbing the slope toward the summit, the father trusting that the provider would not demand the promise without also providing the means for its survival, the son trusting the father who had never led him astray. The mountain loomed above them, a place of impending death, and Abraham believed with every fiber of his being, a place of ultimate provision. Chapter 20. The Binding of Isaac. The summit of Mount Moriah was a barren, wind-scoured place, a bald crown of rock where the only sounds were the whisper of the air and the frantic beating of a father's heart. Abraham's hands, which had built altars of thanksgiving and tents of sojourning, now worked with a terrible, deliberate slowness. He gathered stones from the hard ground, each one cold and unyielding, stacking them into a platform that was both an altar and a tomb. The act was a ritual of profound contradiction, a sacred preparation for an unspeakable act. Isaac watched, his initial excitement now replaced by a growing, bewildered dread. He had helped his father gather the wood, had felt its rough grain against his back, but now he saw the knife in Abraham's belt and the firepot smoldering with coals, and the missing lamb became a chilling, unspoken question mark in the air. When the altar was complete, Abraham turned to his son. His face, usually a map of kindness and faith, was a landscape of agony held in check by an iron will. There were no words of explanation, no final embrace that could soften what was to come. With a tenderness that was itself a form of violence, he took the cords they had brought and bound Isaac's hands and feet. The boy, so trusting, so strong, did not resist. Perhaps he saw the tears standing in his father's eyes, the tremor in his hands that belied the firmness of his actions. Perhaps the faith that had been woven into the very fabric of his life now held him still. He allowed himself to be lifted and laid upon the rough-hewn stones, the wood for the sacrifice stacked beneath him. His wide, trusting eyes looked up into the face of the man who had taught him of God's promises, the man who was now raising a gleaming bronze knife high above his chest. In that suspended moment, the world seemed to stop. The knife caught the harsh sunlight, a shard of destined death poised to fall. Abraham's arm was taut, every muscle and sinew committed to the awful arc of obedience. He had reconciled himself to the loss, had fixed his mind on the character of the God who had given the command, trusting that even in this there was a purpose beyond his understanding. He was prepared to extinguish the laughter, to reduce the promise to ashes, because the one who had sworn the covenant was worthy of this ultimate trust. The love for his son was a physical pain in his chest, a searing fire, but his love for God was the greater conflagration, consuming every doubt, every question. Then from the vast, empty sky, a voice called his name, not once but twice, sharp and urgent. "Abraham! Abraham!" It was the voice of the angel of the Lord, a divine interruption that shattered the trajectory of the knife. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," the angel commanded, the words ringing with a celestial authority that brooked no disobedience. "Do not do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." The knife did not fall. Abraham's arm, frozen in its deadly purpose, slowly lowered. A shuddering breath escaped him, a gasp that was both a sob and a prayer. He looked up, his vision blurred with unshed tears, and saw what had been hidden from him until this very moment. There, in a thicket nearby, its horns caught fast in the tangled branches, was a ram. It was a mature, unblemished male, a perfect substitute, provided by God himself at the precise instant of Abraham's ultimate surrender. The faith that had declared God himself will provide the lamb was vindicated in the most breathtaking way imaginable. With hands that now trembled with a different kind of intensity, the shock of deliverance, Abraham went to the thicket. He freed the ram and took it back to the altar. He untied his son, his fingers fumbling with the knots that had bound the boy to death, and lifted him from the stones. Then, with a heart overflowing with a tumultuous mix of relief, gratitude, and awe, he offered the ram as a burnt offering in place of his son. The fire, which was meant to consume the promise, now consumed the substitute. The smoke that rose from Mount Moriah was not the smoke of a dead dream, but the sweet-smelling aroma of a faith that had been tested to its absolute limit and had not been found wanting. Abraham named that place The Lord will provide, a name that would echo through the generations as a testament to the truth that on the mountain of the Lord provision is always made, and the voice of the angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time. The reaffirmation of the blessing was now more potent, more layered, because it followed the unmaking and remaking of his faith. I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me. The covenant was not broken on the rocks of Moriah. It was sealed in the blood of a ram, cemented by an obedience that trusted God even with the promise itself. The test was over. The Father and the Son, bound by a shared experience of terror and grace, turned from the altar and began the journey down the mountain, leaving behind the place of death and provision, their lives in the future of the promise forever changed. Chapter 21. Death of Sarah. The laughter that had defined their later years was now a memory, its echo fading into the profound silence that filled the tent. 127 years of life, a tapestry woven with threads of journey, doubt, faith, and miraculous joy, had reached its final frayed edge. Sarah, the princess, the mother of nations, drew her last breath in the land of promise, in the city of Hebron. Her passing was not a violent severing, but a quiet surrender, the slow extinguishing of a lamp that had burned long and brightly against impossible odds. The vibrant woman who had once laughed in scornful disbelief and later in triumphant joy was now still, her celebrated beauty softened into the serene mask of eternity. The news spread through the camp like a cold wind, stilling the daily rhythms of life. The bleating of the flocks, the chatter of the servants, the crackle of the cooking fires, all of it fell into a hushed reverence. Abraham, the patriarch who had faced down kings and received covenants from God, was brought to his knees by this most intimate of losses. He entered the tent and saw her, and the sight undid him. The great faith that had withstood the test of the binding knife now crumpled under the weight of a more common, yet more personal, sorrow. He knelt beside her, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The grief of a man who had lost not just his wife, but his companion through a century of wandering, the one who had shared the terror of Pharaoh's court and the bewildering joy of Isaac's birth. He mourned for her, and the sound of his weeping was the only tribute in the quiet tent, a raw, human counterpoint to the divine promises that had defined their life together. When the first, sharp edge of his grief had passed, a practical and profound need arose from the sorrow. He could not leave her among the living. She needed a resting place, a permanent possession in the land that God had sworn to give his descendants. This was not the land of his fathers. He was a stranger and a sojourner here, a man of altars and tents, not of deeds and tombs. Yet his faith, even in the depths of his mourning, remained steadfast. God had promised this land to his offspring, and Sarah, the mother of that offspring, would be its first permanent occupant. Her burial would be an act of faith, a declaration that he believed the promise of possession so completely that he would lay his dead to rest in its soil. He rose from his knees, his face lined with grief, but his resolve clear. The love he had for her demanded a worthy tomb, and his faith in God's promise demanded that it be here, in the land of Canaan. He would secure a burial place not as a temporary measure, but as the first down payment on an eternal inheritance. Chapter 22, Purchase of Machpelah. The time for mourning was set aside for the necessities of business, a somber transition from private grief to public negotiation. Abraham, his stature in the land, that of a powerful and respected chieftain, went to the Hittites, the sons of Heth, who dwelled in Hebron. He came before them at the city gate, the place of assembly and legal transaction, and bowed respectfully. His voice, though heavy with sorrow, was clear and firm. "I am a foreigner and stranger among you," he declared, stating his status plainly. "Sell me some property for a burial site here so I can bury my dead." The Hittites' response was one of profound deference, a recognition of the patriarch's standing among them. "Sir, listen to us," they replied. "You are a mighty prince among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our tombs. None of us will refuse you his tomb for burying your dead." It was a generous offer to intercede in one of their own sepulchres, a gesture of integration and honor. But Abraham wanted more than a borrowed tomb. He wanted a possession, a plot of land that would belong to him and his descendants in perpetuity. He rose and bowed again before the people of the land, a picture of humility and resolve. He made his request specific. "If you are willing to let me bury my dead out of my sight, listen to me and intercede with Ephron, son of Zohar, on my behalf. So he will sell me the cave of Machpelah, which belongs to him and is at the end of his field. Ask him to sell it to me for the full price as a burial site among you." The cave of Machpelah was his objective, a specific, tangible piece of the promised land he wished to own. Ephron the Hittite, who was sitting among his people, heard the request and answered Abraham in the hearing of everyone at the city gate. "No, my lord," he said, his words dripping with the polite formalism of Eastern negotiation. "Listen to me. I give you the field, and I give you the cave that is in it. I give it to you in the presence of my people. Bury your dead." It was a public show of magnanimity, an offer of a gift, but Abraham understood the unspoken rules of such exchanges. To accept it as a gift would place him in a position of perpetual obligation, a client to Ephron's patronage. It would undermine the very permanence and independence he sought. Again, Abraham bowed before the people of the land, but he addressed Ephron directly, his tone respectful yet unyielding. "Listen to me, if you will. I will pay the price of the field. Accept it from me so I can bury my dead there." He insisted on a transaction, a sale, for the full price. He would not be a recipient of charity. He would be a lawful owner. Ephron, his true intention now clear, named his price. "Listen to me, my lord," he said. "The land is worth 400 shekels of silver, but what is that between you and me? Bury your dead." The sum was significant, a high price for a field and a cave, stated as if it were a trifle. But Abraham did not haggle. He did not question the value. In the hearing of all the Hittites who had come to the gate of the city, he weighed out for Ephron the silver he had named, 400 shekels of silver, according to the weight current among the merchants. The coins, or perhaps the cut pieces of silver, were counted out, the metallic clink a stark sound in the tense silence. The transaction was public, legal, and binding. So Ephron's field in Machpelah near Mamre, the field with its cave and all the trees within the boundaries of the field, was deeded over to Abraham as his property in the presence of all the Hittites who had come to the gate of the city. The negotiations were over. The politeness and the posturing fell away, leaving only the cold, hard fact of a sale. After this, Abraham buried his wife Sarah in the cave of the field of Machpelah near Mamre, which was at Hebron in the land of Canaan. The cave became a sanctuary of memory and a monument to faith. In that act of burial, Abraham, the sojourner, took permanent legal possession of his first piece of the promised land. It was not a conquest won by the sword, but a tomb purchased with silver, a quiet, sorrowful, yet profoundly confident first step toward the fulfillment of a nation-sized promise, secured through the love for a woman and the unwavering belief in the Word of God. Chapter 23. Finding a wife for Isaac, the silence of the tent felt heavier now, a palpable emptiness where Sarah's presence had once been a constant anchoring force. Abraham was a man advanced in years, blessed by the Lord in all things, yet the weight of his own mortality pressed upon him with a new urgency. The promise was secure. Isaac, the son of laughter, was the living heir. But the future of the covenant now hinged on the next generation, on the woman who would stand beside his son. The thought of Isaac taking a wife from the daughters of Canaan, from among the people whose gods were rooted in every hill and grove, filled Abraham with a cold dread. Such a union would entangle the chosen line with pagan practices, diluting the faith he had struggled so hard to preserve. The purity of the promise demanded a wife from his own kin, from the house of his brother Nahor in far-off Mesopotamia, a woman raised in the shadow of the same stories, the same bloodline. He summoned his oldest servant, the manager of his entire household, a man whose loyalty was as steadfast as the ancient terebinth trees of Mamre. This servant was more than an employee. He was a trusted steward, a man who had witnessed the miracles and the tests, who understood the sacred nature of the legacy he helped manage. Abraham called the man to him, and in the quiet of his tent, with the dust of Hebron settling around them, he gave him a charge of immense gravity. Placing a hand on his own aged thigh, he administered a solemn oath. "Swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you will not get a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I am living, but will go to my country and my own relatives and get a wife for my son Isaac." The gesture was one of ultimate seriousness, binding the servant to this sacred mission with the full weight of the covenant itself. The servant, a practical man accustomed to long journeys and complex tasks, understood the potential pitfalls. "What if the woman is unwilling to come back with me to this land?" he asked, his voice low with concern. "Shall I then take your son back to the country you came from?" The question was logical, but to Abraham it was unthinkable. The memory of the divine call was as vivid as yesterday. He had left that land for a reason, and the covenant was tied to this soil, the soil of Canaan. His response was immediate and fierce. "Make sure that you do not take my son back there," he commanded. "The Lord, the God of heaven, who brought me out of my father's household and my native land, and who spoke to me and promised me on oath, saying, 'To your offspring I will give this land,' he will send his angel before you so that you can get a wife for my son from there." His faith, tested and proven on Mount Moriah, was now absolute. He trusted not in the servant's negotiating skills, but in the divine guidance that had never failed him. If the woman is unwilling to come back with you, then you will be released from this oath of mine, he concluded, placing the outcome squarely in the hands of God. The mission was to be one of divine appointment, not human coercion. The servant, thus bound by the oath, prepared for the long journey north. He selected 10 of his master's camels, loading them with all kinds of goods from Abraham's vast wealth, finely woven fabrics, spices, silver, and gold. The caravan was a moving testament to the prosperity God had bestowed, a tangible promise of the life that awaited the chosen bride. With a small contingent of men, the servant set out, leaving the hills of Canaan behind and heading for Aram Naharaim, the city of Nahor in Mesopotamia. The journey was long and arduous, crossing arid plains and following the winding course of the great river. The dust of the road coated the fine trappings, and the sun beat down upon the small procession, but the servant's mind was fixed not on the hardships of the journey, but on the enormity of his task. He was not merely fetching a woman, he was seeking the next matriarch, the one who would mother the promised nation. He arrived at his destination as the evening sun cast long shadows across the land. The city was bustling with the day's end activities, but his eyes sought out the central place of community life, the well outside the city. It was there, at the hour when the women came out to draw water, that his search would begin. He made the camels kneel down near the well, their weary groans a soft accompaniment to the pounding of his own heart. The weight of his responsibility felt heavier than any load the camels had carried. He was a stranger in a foreign land, tasked with identifying a single woman based on a character he could not know, and a divine sign he could only hope to see. In that moment of profound uncertainty, he turned to the only source of guidance he trusted. He bowed his head and prayed not to the gods of Mesopotamia, but to the Lord, the God of his master Abraham. His prayer was specific, a plea for a sign of unmistakable clarity. "Lord, God of my master Abraham," he whispered, his words meant for divine ears alone, "make me successful today and show kindness to my master Abraham. See, I am standing beside this spring, and the daughters of the townspeople are coming out to draw water. May it be that when I say to a young woman, 'Please let down your jar that I may have a drink,' and she says, 'Drink, and I'll water your camels too,' let her be the one you have chosen for your servant Isaac. By this I will know that you have shown kindness to my master." The test was one of extraordinary character. To offer a drink to a weary traveler was common courtesy, but to volunteer to water 10 thirsty camels, an act that required drawing dozens of heavy jars of water from a deep well, was a demonstration of a truly generous, industrious, and kind heart. It was this kind of woman, a woman of selfless action, who would be worthy of the covenant. Before he had even finished praying, while the words of his petition still hung in the quiet evening air, a young woman named Rebekah emerged from the city, her water jar balanced gracefully on her shoulder. Chapter 24. Rebekah comes. The well was the city's beating heart, a deep, stone-rimmed mouth in the earth where the day's rhythms converged and life's essential transactions unfolded. The servant watched the young women approach, a colorful procession, against the dusty landscape, their laughter and chatter a foreign music to his ears. His own heart was a silent drum of prayer, his plea for a sign still hanging in the twilight air like an unspoken covenant between him and the God of his master. And then he saw her. Rebekah emerged from the crowd, not with a flourish, but with a natural, unassuming grace that seemed to command the very space around her. She was the daughter of Bethuel, son of Milcah and Nahor, Abraham's own brother. The bloodline was there, a hidden thread of promise woven into her being, but it was her actions that would reveal her heart. She moved to the well, her steps light and sure, and filled her jar with water. As she turned, the jar balanced expertly on her shoulder. Her eyes met those of the weary traveler. The servant, his throat parched from the long road and his spirit thirsty for a sign, rose and approached her. His request was simple, a test wrapped in the guise of a traveler's need. "Please give me a little water from your jar," he said, his voice rough with dust and hope. Rebekah did not hesitate. "Drink, my lord," she said, and with a swift, generous motion, she lowered the jar from her shoulder and gave him a drink. The water was cool and life-giving, a simple mercy that quenched a physical thirst, but she was not finished. As the servant drank, she looked past him to the 10 camels kneeling patiently, their great, shaggy forms weary and dust-caked. She saw their dry noses, their patient, resigned eyes. "I'll draw water for your camels, too," she offered, "until they have finished drinking." The words were not a polite suggestion, but a statement of intent, a declaration of a kindness that went far beyond common courtesy. Without waiting for a reply, she emptied what remained in her jar into the trough and hurried back to the well to draw more water. The servant watched, transfixed as she worked. The task was Herculean. A thirsty camel could drink vast quantities, and there were 10 of them. She ran back and forth, her slender frame straining with the heavy, water-filled jar, her movements a study in tireless, selfless industry. She poured and drew and poured, her face flushed with the effort, but her expression remained one of serene purpose. The sound of the water splashing into the stone trough was a rhythmic counterpoint to the servant's pounding heart. This was the sign, the exact improbable sign he had prayed for. The character revealed in this act, the initiative, the strength, the boundless generosity, was the very soul of the covenant. This was the woman for Isaac. When the camels had finished drinking, the servant, overwhelmed with a gratitude that was both human and divine, took out a gold nose ring weighing a half shekel and 2 gold bracelets weighing 10 shekels. He presented them to her, his hands trembling slightly. "Whose daughter are you?" he asked, his voice filled with a reverent awe. "Please tell me, is there room in your father's house for us to spend the night?" Rebekah looked at the gleaming gold, then back at the man, her eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and understanding. "I am the daughter of Bethuel, the son that Milcah bore to Nahor," she replied, naming the very lineage that connected her to Abraham. "We have plenty of straw and fodder," she added, "and room for you to spend the night." The confirmation was complete. The God of Abraham had not only provided a sign, he had led him directly to the door of his master's own kin. The servant bowed his head and worshipped the Lord on the spot. "Praise be to the Lord, the God of my master Abraham," he declared, his voice thick with emotion, "who has not abandoned his kindness and faithfulness to my master. As for me, the Lord has led me on the journey to the house of my master's relatives. He stood there at the well of the divine appointment, a man who had witnessed the meticulous faithfulness of God in the simple, generous act of a young woman drawing water. He was welcomed into the house of Bethuel and Laban, Rebekah's brother. The hospitality was lavish. A feast was prepared, but the servant refused to eat until he had told his story. He recounted everything: Abraham's wealth and blessing, the solemn oath sworn concerning a wife for Isaac, his own prayer at the well, and the breathtakingly precise fulfillment in Rebekah's actions. He laid the matter bare, presenting it not as his own quest, but as the undeniable guidance of the Lord. Now then, he concluded, if you will show kindness and faithfulness to my master, tell me, and if not, tell me, so I may know which way to turn. Laban and Bethuel could offer no argument. The hand of God was too evident to deny. This is from the Lord, they said. We can say nothing to you one way or the other. Here is Rebekah. Take her and go, and let her become the wife of your master's son, as the Lord has directed. The consent was given, the divine will acknowledged. The servant, his mission accomplished, again worshipped the Lord, and then brought out gold and silver jewelry and articles of clothing, and gave them to Rebekah. He also gave costly gifts to her brother and her mother. The transaction was sealed with wealth, but its true currency was faith. The following morning, when the servant was eager to depart, Rebekah's family asked for her to remain with them for 10 days. But the servant, conscious of the divine urgency that had guided his entire journey, insisted on leaving immediately. The decision was put to Rebekah. "Will you go with this man?" they asked her. Her answer was as swift and decisive as her offer to water the camels. "I will go," she said. There was no hesitation, no demand for more time, no fear of the unknown journey to a land and a husband she had never seen. Her consent was an act of faith that mirrored Abraham's own departure from Haran. She was leaving her homeland, her family, everything familiar, to become part of a story whose full scope she could not possibly comprehend. She trusted the signs. She trusted the story of the faithful God, and she trusted the call. They sent her on her way with her nurse and her maids, blessing her and speaking over her the words that would echo through the ages. "Our sister, may you increase to thousands upon thousands. May your offspring possess the gates of their enemies." The caravan set out, retracing the long road back to Canaan. Rebekah rode upon a camel, the vast, unfamiliar landscape unfolding before her. She was a living answer to a prayer, a vessel of kindness, chosen to carry the promise forward, journeying toward a destiny and a man she had yet to meet. Her heart a blend of youthful courage and of faith that was only just beginning to bloom, fulfilling a plan set in motion decades before beside a different well, under a different sky. Chapter 25. Abraham's later years and death. The great caravan of life, which had journeyed so far and weathered so many storms, now entered its final peaceful stretch. With Isaac happily settled with his bride Rebekah in the tents of the Negev, a profound contentment settled over Abraham's soul. The clamor of divine calls, the terror of tests, and the sharp pains of loss had all faded into a quiet, golden twilight. The promise was secure, its future now resting in the hands of the next generation. In these later years, a season of quiet, personal renewal began for the aged patriarch. He took another wife, a woman named Keturah. This union was not one of desperate striving, like the taking of Hagar, but a gentle companionship for a man in the autumn of his life. With Keturah he fathered more sons, Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shuah. The laughter of these new children filled his tents, a late-blooming orchard of life that testified to the enduring vitality God had bestowed upon him. Yet Abraham's heart, shaped by a century of walking with God, remained fixed on the primacy of the covenant. He had learned through painful experience the danger of divided inheritance, the strife that could spring from blurred lines of succession. With a clarity born of that hard-won wisdom, he took decisive action to protect the promise. While he was still living, he gave gifts to the sons of his concubines, to Keturah's children, ensuring they would be provided for. But then, with solemn finality, he sent them away from his son Isaac, eastward to the land of the east. He separated them just as he had separated from Lot, creating a necessary distance to preserve the integrity of the divine line. To Isaac, and to Isaac alone, Abraham gave all that he owned, every sheep, every goat, every servant, every well he had dug, and every right he had purchased, including the field of Machpelah with its cave, passed to the son of the promise. It was a transfer not just of wealth, but of destiny, a deliberate and faith-filled act that funneled the entire legacy of his long life through the single channel God had ordained. The years continued their gentle, unyielding march. Abraham lived to see his son Isaac become a man of substance and faith, and he saw the beginnings of the love that grew between Isaac and Rebekah, a love that would one day comfort his son after his own passing. He had been granted a full measure of days, 175 years, a span that stretched from the bustling city of Ur to the quiet plains of Canaan. His body, once strong enough to pursue armies and build altars, was now weary, its strength spent. He did not die in the tumult of battle or the agony of plague, but breathed his last in a good old age, an old man and full of years. His death was a peaceful surrender, the final exhale of a life lived in faithful, if sometimes faltering, pursuit of a divine call. He was gathered to his people, a phrase that spoke of a reunion in the quiet halls of eternity with those who had gone before him, including his beloved Sarah. His two eldest sons, Isaac and Ishmael, came together for this final act of filial duty. The old rivalry, the painful separation, was set aside at the tomb's mouth. Together they carried their father's body to the cave of Machpelah, the field Abraham had purchased from Ephron the Hittite as a permanent possession in the land of his sojourning. There, in the quiet darkness of the cave, he was buried with Sarah, his wife. The man who had lived in tents was laid to rest in the only piece of the promised land he would ever personally own, a down payment on an inheritance his descendants would one day fully possess. And so, Abraham's journey ended where it had begun, in an act of faith. He left behind not just a bloodline, but a legacy. He was the father of nations, the friend of God, the man who believed the Lord, and it was credited to him as righteousness. His story, woven with threads of fear and courage, failure and triumph, would be told and retold for generations, a timeless testament that the life of faith is a long obedience in the same direction, a journey toward a promise that is always, ultimately, fulfilled by the one who calls.